The hectic festival finally came to an end, however. Even after the festival ended, its aftermath remained like burning embers. It was daytime and the students were heading towards the academy. Among them there were 3 boys. One of them asked his friends if it was true that the night bloodhound had come to the academy during the festival. The boy wearing glasses turned his head towards his friends, and with a serious gaze revealed that he had heard that the night bloodhound had come to commit another attack. The blonde-haired boy began to observe his friend, and with a sincere expression said that according to rumors the teachers had intervened to stop the night hound. Upon hearing this, the black-haired student's eyes widened with disdain and fear. According to him, the night hound was someone evil who deserved to be immediately locked up in prison. Then, he closed his eyes, extended his hands and mentioned that it was said that this time a new villain had also appeared, an unregistered black mage. With a sincere gaze, the boy wearing glasses turned towards them and explained that he had heard that the 2 villains fought each other, and thanks to that, the teachers were able to stop them quickly. The blonde-haired boy began to observe his friends in silence, without interrupting. The 3 friends continued talking among themselves with smiles on their faces, and passed near the wall that had been destroyed by Vikar's attack. The students, unaware of anything, chatted happily with carefree voices. The night bloodhound incident, which could have ended in a terrifying tragedy if it hadn't been contained, seemed to fade away like a simple and chilling rumor. The students entered the academy and began heading toward their classrooms. Somewhere down the hallway there was a door. It was the journalism club. Inside were all the members of the club sitting around a table that was full of newspapers. Dollars stood up, placed her hand on top of the table, and with an angry expression demanded to know who had written this article. Vikar and the others began to observe the articles in silence. Among the articles, there was one with a photograph of the night bloodhound with eyes shining with evil and covered in blood stains. The article was about the atrocities of the night hound. His misdeeds had surpassed all limits since he had attacked the Imperial Academy, according to the person who had written the article. The acts of the night hound were premeditated, so he was considered anti-humanitarian and anti-state, a villain that must be punished without fail. During the festival, among the main facilities destroyed in the Imperial Capital War, the Imperial Bank, the Capital Clock Tower, the Indulgentia Orphanage, and the Imperial National Cemetery, Dollars took hold of the article with her hand, and while her eyes were shining with rage, she began to stare at Vikar and at everyone else, making it clear that even though Night Hound had come to the festival, he had not caused any commotion. Chaos had been caused by that mysterious black mage. Everyone's attention was fixed on Dollars and their eyes widened in surprise and confusion, while on the other hand, our boy showed no emotion. Dollars had read the article, and according to her it seemed as if the Night Hound had come to the festival to massacre the students, and even though she knew that he was a criminal according to the laws of the Empire, she was certain that that day during the festival he had done nothing out of the ordinary. According to her, the article should focus more on facts and less on emotions, simply listing the facts. She demanded to know who had written this article. With a nervous gaze, Piggy began shaking his hands in denial. Tutor's attention focused on Piggy and his eyes expanded with fear and panic. He did not know what to say. While on the other hand, with a calm expression, our boy began observing the articles in silence. Dollar's attention was fixed on Vikar and her eyes began to shine with seriousness upon realizing that the person who had written the article was him. Vikar argued that he had written the article according to the instructions of Professor Venci Morg, the club's advisor. Dollars placed her hands on the table and felt furious, since all this had happened while she was not present. Vikar began to observe her with a serene expression and remembered that she had been busy during the festival season with her student council duties. Upon hearing this, her eyes began to shine with confusion. She put her hands into the pocket of her pants, and while taking something out, let out a sigh and explained that if she was not present it did not mean that they should write an article without verifying the facts. She took out 3 articles that she had in her pocket and left them on top of the table, placed her hand on top of them, revealing that they were official statements issued this morning by the Imperial Guard. They assured that the one responsible for destroying the main facilities of the capital had not been Nightblood Hound. She took 3 photographs of the facilities where the Nightblood Hound had been. It was night and everything was destroyed, but there were strange marks on the ground. She knew that the main weapon of the Nightblood Hound was a sword. But upon observing the recent scenes of the attacks, there were almost no sword marks. Only traces remained as if a gigantic snake had crawled through the place. She began to imagine a woman holding a whip and surrounded by a white snake with purple eyes. She revealed that the official name of this villain was Ms. Al-Rabaraz, a creature whose gender identity was presumed female. The motive for the attack was unknown. It was estimated that she had the same level as a graduator, and the weapon she used had not been revealed. She revealed that all witnesses were dead. Upon hearing this, Tudor's and Sancho's eyes widened in surprise and fear, putting them on alert. Dollars, who had one hand resting on the table, began to show 3 fingers with the other, and while her eyes were shining with seriousness, she started to stare at Vakar and asked him not to keep blaming all the evil deeds on the Nightblood Hound. There were 3 villains, so they should clearly distinguish the crimes committed by each one. With a serene expression, Vakar did not say a single word, until several seconds later, he nodded his head. Actually, this did not matter much to him since he was criticizing the Nighthound in case someone suspected him in the future. He was just trying to create an antagonistic image between them. Tudor crossed his hands, rested his head on them, and while his eyes were shining with curiosity and fear, he could not help but wonder where the new villain Ms. Ouroboros had come from. Sancho crossed his arms, and with a serene gaze mentioned that the only thing they knew about her was that she left marks that looked like a giant snake had passed through there. With a surprised gaze, Sinclair raised her hand and asked how they were sure that she was a woman. Dollars placed her hands on top of the table, and with a serious expression began to imagine a rock with a lipstick mark, revealing that in all her crime scenes there was a lipstick mark. Realizing that she wanted everyone to know that she had been the one who had committed them, Piggy extended his hands to the sides and his eyes began to shine with confusion. Tudor started to show a finger and everyone began to chat among themselves. Vikar, who was sitting among them, began to look at the ground in silence. Vikar's attention was fixed on Dollars and his eyes began to shine with rage. He did not know if the new villain idolized or felt resentment towards the Nighthound. But he did not care what her objective was since he would have to eliminate her if she crossed his path during his demon hunt. At that moment, Anna, who was holding a pile of papers, kicked open the door and announced her arrival. She approached the table and left the papers on top. Dollar's attention was fixed on them and her eyes filled with confusion because she did not know what all these documents were. With a sincere gaze, Anna explained that they had received a lot of reports after the festival concluded. She took out a letter, approached Vikar and revealed that there was also a letter for him. Vikar began to look towards the ground and with a calm expression, extended his hand to take the letter and thanked her. Vikar took the letter and opened it. His eyes filled with confusion upon seeing that this letter was for him. Upon reading the content of the letter, Vikar's eyes widened in surprise, making him panic. While he was distracted reading the letter silently, Sinclair approached him and her attention fixed on the letter. She felt curious to know what it contained. The letter was a notice of payment for the first semester tuition. The next day, Vikar went to visit his brother and the little Pomeranian sat on his knees. She closed her eyes and could not help but smile and feel happy. Osiris mentioned that he could provide him with the money for his tuition. Osiris, who was sitting on the sofa in front of Vikar, picked up a cup of tea and while the sun rays were entering the room, asked what was really bothering Vikar. Our boy started to gaze towards the floor and sank into his thoughts, then began to pet the head of the little Pomeranian, and with a sincere expression said that he wanted to hide that he was a Baskerville while at the academy. Feeling that Vikar was petting her, Pomeranian placed her hands on top of Vikar's hands and could not help but feel even happier. The reality was that Vikar did not want his daily life to become complicated after it was discovered that he used the Baskervilles' money. He began to imagine Sinclair, Bianca, and Dolores offering him disguises with a loving gaze. He knew he only had 1 week until the enrollment deadline, but he did not want to take on any of the jobs that the girls had suggested. Vikar closed his eyes and felt worried since not receiving the full scholarship due to his behavior had caused him problems. Osiris prepared to take a sip of tea and his attention focused on Vikar. His eyes widened with curiosity since he wondered why Vikar was trying so hard to hide his skills. But then his mind was filled with surprise as a realization came to his mind. He could not help but wonder if Vikar wished to become the powerful hero who hid his strength. In the past, while the children were playing, little Osiris crossed his arms and stood in front of a tree. He began to blush imagining himself defeating a horde of monsters. There was a time when he also longed to be someone like that, hiding his strength and living among the weak before revealing his true power at the right moment. In a matter of seconds, the little Pomerian fell asleep like a log. With a calm expression, Osiris suggested to our boy the idea of dedicating himself to monster hunting part-time. Vikar's attention fixed on his brother and his eyes widened in surprise. Osiris suggested going to the Explorers Guild and hiring an explorer to go hunt monsters with him. He was willing to give our boy more opportunities to make his dream come true. With a confused gaze, Vikar began touching his chin since he didn't know if that would help him make his dream come true. With a serious gaze, Vikar sank into his thoughts. Thinking about the Explorers Guild, he remembered that there was an explorer who interested him. He began to imagine a swordsman with a ponytail. He was one of the heroes who had made a great contribution to the human coalition when the era of ruin arrived. Most of the field guides on demonic creatures that he knew had been created thanks to him. Later, the School of Monster Sonography had also been based on his research. Vikar remembered his tragic death, knowing that this guy was a country bumpkin who was not affiliated with anyone. During a battle with demons, he had no one to support him, which led to his premature death. Our boy knew a lot about him. A smile appeared on his face when he thought that he should earn this guy's trust while he was alive for the sake of the future. He thanked his brother and decided to do so. Upon hearing this, Osiris' eyes filled with joy and he could not help but feel happy. Somewhere in the city was the guide guild called Sherpa. It was starting to get dark and someone announced that the guild master was back. One of the men asked how today's hunt had been. The guild master stomped on the ground forcefully, making the men's jaws drop in surprise. The guild master, a blond man, carried on his back the body of a giant boar. He began to point at the boar with his thumb, and while his eyes were shining with confidence, he began to show a smile and said that the hunt had been a complete success. This guy was called Miniature Pinscher Aka Mini Pin. He left the boar's body on the ground and people approached to see the beast. They had no doubt that the graduates were on another level. Mini Pin started to move towards the guild door and decided to take a break. He entered his office, sat down and started reading a book. Mini Pin rested his head on the table, started touching his head with his hand and felt worried, since they were in trouble again this month. He did not have enough money to cover their food expenses and the salaries of the guild members. His eyes filled with worry and sadness since due to the large guilds of mercenaries, he could not do what he wanted, and it was normal that he was so distressed for not having support. He stood up, knowing that it was all his fault, since if he had not been scammed when he was young while trying to pursue his dream, now he would not be struggling financially. He opened a drawer which contained a towel. Mini Pin grabbed the towel and felt like an idiot, closing his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his face. If there was still an opportunity, he wanted to pursue his dream. He intertwined his hands and began to imagine the symbol of the Baskerville family. His dream was to enter the Baskerville family. At that moment, someone wearing brown boots began to walk through the area. This person wore a hood. He approached the body of the boar and asked if anyone knew where Mini Pin was. Upon hearing this, the attention of the men focused on him. With a serious gaze, the man approached the hooded man and noticed that this guy was young. He asked how someone like him dared to say their guild master's name so casually. The hooded man said that he was just a client who had come to make a commission. Upon hearing this, the other man asked if he believed that clients could act as if they were superior. Without wasting another second, the hooded man turned his back on him and walked away thinking that this guy was very annoying. Seeing this, the blond man's eyes widened in surprise. With a furious gaze, he turned around and tried to grab him. But at that moment, the hooded person moved like thunder and shifted away, leaving the man in shock. He and his men tried to catch the hooded man. But with a murderous gaze, the man moved quickly, avoiding being caught. Then, he took momentum and made a jump, until he appeared right in front of the guildmaster's office window. Upon feeling this, Minnie Pin's eyes, who had his hands intertwined, were filled with surprise. The hooded man stood at the window and asked if this was the guildmaster's room. Judging by Minnie Pin's build, he realized that he was the guildmaster. Upon hearing this, Minnie Pin's eyes widened in confusion. He stood up, clenched his fist, and with a confused gaze demanded to know who he was. The hooded man sat on the window and revealed that he was a client who had come to make a commission. Minnie Pin's face filled with sweat and his jaw dropped in surprise. The man got down from the window, approached Minnie Pin, took out a sheet and revealed that it was his commission request. Minnie Pin's attention fixed on him and he could not help but go on alert, realizing that this guy was fast. He was so fast that he had not had time to react, realizing that he was someone very skilled. Minnie Pin took the commission request and began to read carefully, but made it clear that he could not come here without making an official request. But then his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. The hooded man began to remove his hood and revealed that the guide he wanted to hire was Minnie Pin. Upon hearing this, the guild master's body began to tremble. The hooded man could not forget the famous person who visited endlessly the Baskerville family because he wanted to become a vassal. Minnie Pin's face filled with sweat and his eyes filled with fear. The hooded person was none other than Vikir. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, after a few hours, night fell, Minnie Pin and Vikir were walking through the village. Minnie Pin was reading the request report of our boy, and according to the request, he had affiliation with the Colosseum Academy, and the reason for the request was that he wanted to hire a guide for the purpose of killing monsters. While Vikir was walking beside him with a serious gaze, Minnie Pin's attention was fixed on our boy, and he couldn't help but blush and feel somewhat surprised. He couldn't believe that this boy truly belonged to the Baskerville family. Minnie Pin stood in front of Vikir and bowed his head before him as a sign of respect. For him it was an honor to work with someone like Vikir. Upon seeing his attitude, our boy couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a sincere expression, Minnie Pin admitted that he really wished he could see a member of the Baskerville family at least once. Vikir began to observe him, and with a serious gaze asked him not to make so much noise and to calm down a little. Minnie Pin apologized, revealing that his dream was to join the Baskerville family. Upon hearing this, Vikir's eyes began to shine with surprise, thinking calmly and seeing that from this time Minnie Pin wished to become a servant of the Baskervilles. He realized that then, before he returned in time, Minnie Pin must have dreamed about it for a long time. Minnie Pin clenched his fists and, blushing with excitement, mentioned with a smile that the Baskervilles were a family that subdued monsters on the Western Front, known as the Iron-Blooded Sword family. He knew that if he became a member of the family, they would teach him the invincible fencing of the Baskerville style. With a depressed gaze, Minnie Pin began to touch his head, and in a sincere tone admitted that he wanted to get a house, and also some land. He had thought that was the only way to give his wife a good life, but unfortunately, he had been scammed by brokers and his whole life had gone to waste. Vikir's eyes began to shine with seriousness. He knew that although Minnie Pin seemed weak, he was a supreme graduate. He was at a level where he could even belong to the highest mercenary guild. Vikir began to look down at the ground and with a smile revealed that he could make that dream come true, but that was going to depend on what Minnie Pin did. Upon hearing this, Minnie Pin's eyes widened in surprise, and then an excited smile appeared on his face. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. With a gaze full of emotion, he promised to work hard. After a few hours, Minnie Pin was driving a carriage full of goods in the middle of the night. Our boy had a secret mission, so for this reason he attended the academy undercover. It was a secret even within the family, so he received no help from Baskerville. For this reason, he had turned to Minnie Pin, the most capable guide in this area, to help him pay his tuition. Upon hearing this, Meanie Pin put his hand over his mouth and his eyes filled with tears and surprise. He couldn't believe that the person he respected most within Baskerville, Vikier, had personally praised him. Vikier was sitting among the merchandise. Our boy clasped his hands and with a serene expression asked Meanie Pin to call him employer from now on and not by his name. While Meanie Pin's eyes were shining with determination, he clenched his fist and said he would keep that in mind. Vikier began to observe Meanie Pin with a curious expression and explained that he was a student at the academy and asked which monsters were not so strange, even if he hunted many of them. With a sincere expression, Meanie Pin turned his head toward him and with a smile explained that the Knoll was a monster that was not too strong, but still could be worth a lot. Knoll was a strange creature with the head of a hyena and the body of a dwarf that lived in groups in the highlands on the outskirts of the ecliptic. The individual risk level was only C+, but when they gathered as a colony, it could reach up to maximum A. Meanie Pin, who was driving the merchandise carriage, explained that since these monsters' individual combat power was weak, even a first-year student from the academy could easily hunt many of them, so Vikier would not be very suspicious. And since it was an ecosystem disruptor designated by the imperial family, there was a reward per head. Their skin, meat, and even bones could be sold. Vikier began to observe Meanie Pin closely and noticed that this guy was really competent. A few hours later, they arrived at the habitat of the Knoll, and the merchandise carriage stopped. The area was full of Knolls. Some carried swords as weapons and others were prowling around the area. Vikier and Meanie Pin hid behind the bushes and their attention was fixed on the monsters. With a serious gaze, Meanie Pin began to point at the monsters with his finger and revealed that they had the habit of collecting shiny things. So the most common hunting method was to scatter glass balls to attract them and kill them. Vikier, who was sitting next to him, remained silently watching the monsters. While his eyes were shining calmly, he realized that this was a method one should use when encountering a small number of Knolls. Upon hearing this, Meanie Pin's eyes widened in surprise and he nodded his head since Vikier's analysis was accurate. While they were talking, a snake that was hidden in the branches of a tree began to look at them with a murderous gaze. Just before the snake could take another breath, someone attacked with a fierce slash, cutting the snake's head in half. Meanie Pin's eyes filled with fear and confusion since he didn't know how Vikier had cut the snake without a sword. The snaky's head fell to the ground. Vikier began pointing backward with his thumb and with a curious gaze asked if there was oil in the barrels of the carriage. With his face full of sweat, Meanie Pin nodded. Blood began to emerge from the corpse of the snake. Vikier's cut had been clean. Our boy felt happy because with the barrels of oil they were going to be able to eliminate the entire colony with minimal battle. Meanie Pin's eyes began to shine with surprise. He couldn't believe that Vikier wanted to subdue a colony, that even the Imperial Punitive Force had given up on using only barrels of oil. Vikier began to stare at the monsters and his eyes began to shine with excitement and a smile spread across his face. Seeing this, Meanie Pin couldn't help but feel somewhat confused since he didn't know what the hell Vikier was thinking. Following Vikier's order, Meanie Pin brought some barrels of oil and both approached the entrance of the cave where the Knolls lived. The small monsters did not feel Vikier's presence and entered the cave. Our boy approached the entrance and began to observe them from a corner. Not long after, the monsters turned around and their eyes began to shine with rage. Meanie Pin's eyes filled with fear and confusion. He didn't know how Vikier was going to defeat so many Knolls. If he attacked without a plan, the Knolls could invade nearby villages. Our boy stood in front of the entrance and began to ponder. Meanie Pin's eyes widened with curiosity. He was sure that Vikier would not overlook something like this. Vikier began to walk toward the cave under the moonlight. Meanie Pin wanted to know how our boy was going to subjugate. Meanie Pin left the barrels of oil in front of the entrance of the cave, and both remained silent. While his eyes were shining with rage, Vikier began to gaze toward the ground, and remembered that there were 3 entrances to the lair of the Knolls in this mountain. This was the entrance to the lair of low-level Knolls. Our boy closed his eyes, crouched down, and touched the ground. At that moment, mana began to emerge from his body and travel through the ground. Vikier concentrated even more in the image of flying wine glasses, and a banquet came to his mind. The swordmasters were known as superhumans for a reason. After becoming one, he could feel the aura very clearly. Vikier's mana began to emerge from his hand and travel through the ground. At first nothing happened, but several seconds later, small explosions occurred at the top of the mountain. The ground began to shake and Mini-Pin's eyes filled with fear and confusion. He didn't know what was happening. Not long after, the fierce gnolls, with eyes shining with rage, came out of the cave and began to charge towards them. But just then, Mini-Pin threw the barrels. Seeing this, the monster's jaws dropped in shock. The barrels began to hit the monsters, releasing the oil. Mini-Pin began to throw the barrels with all his strength at the monsters. Vikier, who was holding a torch, couldn't help but smile, since no one would have thought that he would end up using the same strategy he had used when living in the forest. His eyes began to shine with excitement, and a wicked smile spread across his face, although at that time his plan had not worked. This time it was going to work since he was only facing gnolls and not the Manhwa. The oil began to soak the bodies of the monsters, while they were advancing towards our boy. With a wicked smile, Vikier dropped the torch toward the monsters. Upon coming into contact with fire, the oil ignited. An intense blaze began to scorch the monsters, causing them terrible pain. The reason why fire was dangerous in an enclosed space was because it could spread, and the smoke it generated was poisonous. Since he had blocked off the upper entrances, there was no way for the smoke to escape, which caused it to sweep through the entire pack. The inside of the cave began to burn. Vikier and Mini-Pin, who were standing at the entrance, started to watch the fire in silence. Mini-Pin's eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Even though they were monsters, Vikier had not blinked when taking so many lives. He realized that he was much more cruel and meticulous than he had imagined. Feeling Mini-Pin's gaze, Vikier turned his head, and while his eyes were shining with calmness, he remained silent. Mini-Pin's eyes began to shine with admiration since, according to him, Vicky was very cool. Seeing this, with a confused gaze, our boy started touching his head. After a few hours, smoke began to emerge from the mountain, and upon entering inside with a torch, they saw that the cave was filled with gnoll corpses. Mini-Pin began to examine the corpses, and with a serious gaze mentioned that as expected, the gnolls inside the cave had died from smoke inhalation. He had been in the hunting world for a long time, and this was something he had learned from Vikier. With a serene expression, Vikier began to walk through the cave, asking Mini-Pin to forget about the compliments, since some gnolls might have survived, so they should not let their guard down. Mini-Pin put his hand on his chest and couldn't help but feel happy to see that Vikier was worried about him. Vikier's eyes filled with confusion since looking at Mini-Pin reminded him of Secretary General Chihuahua. They both began to walk through the cave, which was now full of monster corpses. Mini-Pin's attention focused on one of the rocks and his eyes widened in surprise. Without wasting a second, he struck the rock using the sword. Upon seeing this, Vikier turned around and with a curious expression asked if there was any problem. Mini-Pin began to strike the rocks with the sword and revealed that he could see man-made traces. Mini-Pin struck hard, breaking the rocks and revealing a secret entrance. Mini-Pin's and Vikier's eyes filled with surprise and fear, leaving them in shock. The secret entrance connected to a room which was full of gold coins. Vikier began to examine the coins, and it didn't take long for him to realize that someone had been using this room as a safe. With a surprised expression, Mini-Pin mentioned that Vikier was jumping to conclusions, since the gnolls used to accumulate shiny things, so it could be that they had accumulated this. Vikier grabbed a gold coin while he was observing it, threw another in the air and asked Mini-Pin to take a look. Mini-Pin grabbed the coin and felt somewhat confused. Our boy revealed that these gold coins could not be released by the bank, because they did not have serial numbers, so there was no way the gnolls could have gotten them. Mini-Pin did not know who would have the courage to keep their money inside the gnoll's lair. Vikier dropped the torch on the ground, stood up and made it clear that one thing was certain. That person was using this place as a treasure and was strong enough to kill all these gnolls and take the gold from them. At that moment, a woman wearing heels approached the cave and stepped hard on the corpse of one of the gnolls. She began licking her hand and with a smile realized that rats had gotten into her coin box. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, Vikir, who was holding the gold coin, stood up and with a serious expression made it clear that one thing was certain. Mini Pin's attention was fixed on the coin and his eyes filled with surprise and confusion, leaving him in shock. The cave was filled with null corpses. The mysterious woman reached the entrance and began to observe the corpses in silence. The entrance to the secret treasure room was hidden in a part of the cave. Our boy revealed that the person who was using this place as storage was someone powerful who had the confidence to kill all the monsters and take the gold coins. Mini Pin began to examine the coins carefully without knowing if Vikir meant that all this loot had been stolen from a bank. Vikir nodded since otherwise it would not make sense for someone to be able to get these coins. With a gaze full of fear, Vikir began to imagine a newspaper and remembered that he had recently read news about the robbery of a bank. He remembered it well since he himself had been the one who had written the article. He knew that a copycat of the Hound continued committing crimes. That guy had destroyed important facilities in the imperial capital only to then disappear and take all the riches that were inside. Among those places there was also a bank. Moreover, all the witnesses had been murdered. And at the crime scene only the footprints of high heels and marks that seemed to be made by a gigantic snake were left behind, and from there that nickname had emerged. Just then, the mysterious woman drew her whip and swung it forcefully. She tried to attack Vikir, but our boy reacted in time and moving his head to one side, dodged the attack without much effort, causing the whip to hit against the wall of the cave. The whip left a mark that looked like it was made by a snake. Instead of panicking or feeling fear, Vikir's eyes began to shine with calm. Meanwhile, on the other side, Mini Pin turned around and his eyes widened in surprise and terror. The mysterious woman picked up the whip and began to walk toward them with elegance. She grabbed the whip tightly and couldn't help but get angry upon seeing that rats had gotten into her coin box. Upon hearing this, Mini Pin couldn't help but go into shock and feel somewhat confused. Our boy quickly realized that this woman was Ouroboros. She clenched her fist tightly and a smile spread across her face, while his eyes were shining with seriousness. Vikir's attention focused on the mark left on the wall by her whip, realizing that the marks which seemed to have been made by a gigantic snake were actually marks left by a whip. He also noticed that she was using magic to distort her voice. With a smile, she extended her hand and couldn't help but feel confused and asked if finding her coin box was bad luck or good luck. With eyes shining with rage and hate, she began to stare fixedly at Vikir and Mini Pin. Her attention was fixed on Vikir, and she couldn't help but grip the whip tightly since she didn't know what he was doing here. Vikir's eyes filled with confusion, leaving him in shock. With a gaze full of fear, Mini Pin prepared to draw his sword. Our boy's mind filled with surprise, and his attention was fixed on her since he noticed that suddenly she had begun to become aware of something. He didn't know if she knew him. Ouroboros put her hand on top of the mask and couldn't help but laugh at the thought that she had good luck. Her eyes began to shine with malice, and an excited smile spread across her face. She couldn't believe that Vikir had entered by himself into her coin box. She began to use her power, causing a powerful mana to start emerging from her body. Mini Pin drew his sword without knowing what was happening. Vikir, who was standing behind, started observing her and instead of panicking, remained calm, realizing that her mana was intense. She was stronger than a graduator. Mini Pin, who had a low graduator rank, wasn't going to be a match for her. His eyes began to shine with determination since he knew that it was him who had to fight against her. But he was afraid since if he showed his true power to someone who already knew him and let them escape, the danger was going to increase, so he didn't know what to do. While Ouroboros' body was releasing an intense aura, with a serene gaze, Vikir began to ponder in silence. Mini Pin turned around and his gaze fixed on Vikir, making his eyes widen in confusion. Realizing that our boy had many things on his mind, Vikir began looking at the ground. It was true that although he was a genius revered as a hero, facing Miss Ouroboros, who was stronger than a graduator, was going to be terrifying. Mini Pin stood in front of Vikir and with a sincere expression mentioned that at this hour the Imperial Guard would be patrolling around the base of the mountain. Upon hearing this, Vikir came out of his thoughts and his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him somewhat confused. Minipin drew his sword and began to imbue it with his mana, making golden mana appear around his body, clenching his teeth with a gaze full of determination. He promised to do everything possible so that Vikir could reach the entrance of the cave, and then escape and call the Imperial Guard. Vikir was somewhat confused. While Minipin's eyes were shining with confidence, with a smile he made it clear that for him it had been an honor to meet Vikir, even if it had been for a short time. Without wasting any more time, Minipin filled himself with determination and began to charge toward Ouroboros. Using all his strength, he grabbed the sword and prepared to attack. As he was slowly getting closer, Ouroboros remained still. Minipin swung the sword forcefully, but to his surprise, Ouroboros reacted in time and dodging the attack and causing his sword to hit the ground. Seeing this, Minipin couldn't help but grit his teeth and feel furious. He didn't know what was happening. He swung the sword forcefully again, but Ouroboros jumped back and dodged the attack once more, making his sword hit the cave wall. She began to imbue her mana into the whip and felt excited to see that this guy had gone crazy. Just before Minipin could react, she attacked with a fierce lash, hitting him under the jaw and making him lose consciousness. The attack was so powerful that it made a deep cut on Minipin's face. He began to retreat until several seconds later, he stomped the ground forcefully. Minipin started to bleed and dropped his sword, which fell to the ground. His body began to tremble. He had lost consciousness for a moment due to the blow. He felt as if his flesh was being torn apart and his bones crushed by that whip. Even though both were graduates, the skill gap was very large due to the difference in rank. Eyes full of rage, Minipin began to stare at her. Then he put his arms in front of his face and began to concentrate, causing golden mana to emerge from his body. Ouroboros decided not to stand idly by. She attacked again several times using the whip. Her attacks did quite a bit of damage to Minipin, causing small cuts all over his body. While the whip was tearing his flesh apart, Minipin stood firm and thought about Vikir. Our boy was a person who one day would become a sword master, and for him it was a shame that Vikir died in this place. Then a smile spread across Minipin's face. Upon seeing this, Ouroboros' eyes filled with fear and confusion, leaving her in shock. With eyes shining with rage and determination, Minipin lunged at her and prepared to attack, since his mission was to die protecting Vikir in this place. But just then, Vikir asked him not to waste his life, and then launched spider silk which stuck to Ouroboros' mask, making her panic. Upon seeing this, Minipin clenched his teeth tightly, not knowing what was happening. Ouroboros put her hand on top of the mask and felt furious as she didn't know what this sticky thing was, but she was aware that she had to remove it quickly. While she was distracted, with eyes shining with rage, Vikir appeared behind her. Just before she could take another breath, Vikir gave her a strong kick in the ribs. The blow was so strong that she clenched her teeth and started to bleed. Seeing this, Minipin's eyes widened in surprise. He couldn't believe that Vikir was so strong. Vikir's kick made Ouroboros' body crash against the cave wall, creating a large curtain of smoke and making the whole mountain shake. Resting his hand on Minipin's shoulder, our boy praised him for being strong. Minipin turned his head toward him and his eyes widened in surprise. He couldn't believe that Vikir was praising him again. With her mouth full of blood, Ouroboros put her hands on her back and couldn't help but grit her teeth according to her. The power that Vikir had was not normal. Minipin's body was full of wounds and he couldn't walk. Vikir carried Minipin's body on his back and his eyes began to shine with seriousness. He knew he wouldn't be able to defeat Ouroboros with just one blow, but he also couldn't show either her or Minipin the realm of Swordmaster, so he decided to take this opportunity to leave. Vikir carried Minipin on his back and began to walk toward the exit of the cave. Ouroboros, who was sitting on the ground, asked where he thought he was going. A few seconds later, they reached the exit of the cave and could see the beautiful moonlight. Just then, with an arrogant gaze, Vikir turned around and advised her to run away quickly since soon they were going to return to the cave along with the Imperial Guard. With her body trembling, Ouroboros placed her hand on top of the ground and couldn't help but feel furious. All Vikir's eyes were shining. With a smile he made it clear that if she was planning to touch his coin box, then she should be prepared to suffer the consequences. He said goodbye to her. Ouroboros clenched her teeth and cursed Vikir under her breath. The only thing she could do was call Vikir bastard. Several minutes had already passed and Mini Pin had lost consciousness. Under the moonlight, Vikir, who was carrying Mini Pin on his back, arrived at the forest. He couldn't help but smile, since for him this was incredible. He had thought that he had lived enough, but there were still many things about himself that he was learning. Vikir began to remember what Mini Pin and Chihuahua had done for him in the past. And by doing this, the memory of himself from his past life came to his mind. Under the moonlight, Vikir began to walk toward the place where the Imperial Guard was patrolling. Mini Pin's loyal appearance reminded him of himself from the past. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, it was night, and not long after, the knights of the Imperial Guard arrived at the entrance of the cave, and upon seeing what had happened, their eyes widened in surprise and confusion. The entrance of the cave was filled with knights, and on the ground there was a mountain of gnoll corpses. The knights were in shock to see that someone had killed so many gnolls. Vikir, who wore a hood, began to observe them with a serene gaze in silence. The expedition to subdue the gnoll village concluded with the arrival of the Imperial Guard. When they arrived, Miss Ouroboros had disappeared, leaving behind a great amount of riches. With the help of carts, the knights began to fill bags with gold coins to take them out of the cave. In the middle of the night, they loaded all the coins into their carriages and prepared to leave. That was how all the loot was confiscated by the Imperial Guard. It was already daytime, and Mini Pin had his face full of bandages, but his eyes were shining with joy and there was a smile on his face. Not long after, Vikir, who was holding 2 bags full of gold coins, appeared, and with a cheerful gaze mentioned that this was the money he had obtained after selling the loot, and receiving the substantial reward for the expedition to annihilate the gnolls. The eyes of Mini Pin, who was lying in bed with his body full of bandages, began to shine peacefully, and he started to ponder in silence. Vikir began to gaze toward Mini Pin and with a smile mentioned that the heat from the fire and the smoke had damaged the leather, but he had sold the bones, teeth, and claws for a large sum of money. Upon hearing this, Mini Pin came out of his thoughts and his attention fixed on Vikir, making a smile appear on his face. Vikir sat in the chair and with a worried expression asked about his wounds. Mini Pin interlaced his hands, turned towards our boy, and with a sincere gaze revealed that every joint hurt, but the doctors had said that once he recovered, he was not going to have problems living a normal life. Upon hearing this, Vikir realized why Mini Pin had reached the rank of graduator. Vikir handed a bag of gold coins to Mini Pin, which fell into his lap. This was a gift. Mini Pin opened the bag and saw that it was full of shiny gold coins. His eyes widened in surprise and his jaw dropped. He had never seen so much money before. Vikir had included a good sum as payment for Mini Pin's help during the expedition and to cover medical expenses, since he knew that in his current state, he was not going to be able to work for some time. Mini Pin began to gaze at the ground, not knowing what to say. While sunlight was entering the room through the window, he clenched his fist and asked if now Vikir was going back to the academy. With a calm expression, Vikir nodded. Mini Pin didn't even lift his head to look Vikir in the eyes. He was happy to have been able to be, even if just for a moment, next to the hero of Baskerville. Vikir's attention fixed on him and his eyes began to shine with curiosity and confusion. Our boy remembered that Mini Pin knew a lot about monster ecology, and upon hearing this, Mini Pin's eyes widened in surprise, making his jaw drop in shock. He extended his hands and with a proud smile revealed that in his youth he had traveled across the entire continent, so he could perfectly distinguish the habits of monsters, the location of their nests, as well as subspecies, variants, subtypes, and superior species. With a lost gaze, Vikir got up from the chair, turned his back to Mini Pin and began to walk away. Upon noticing this, Mini Pin's attention fixed on our boy and his eyes filled with when Vikir asked him to wait here. Mini Pin's eyes filled with tears of joy. Vikir turned his head and with a joyful gaze made it clear that he was going to need his help again. Mini Pin began to gaze at Vikir in silence, not knowing what to say. At the same time, at the academy, Professor Venci Morgi was in his office working. His desk was full of mountains of papers. He was somewhat furious since he knew that he would have to do all the work of the academy by himself. While he was distracted, someone started knocking on his office door. Venti Morgue came out of his trance, lifted his head and gave them permission to enter. It was Dollars, who was holding several petitions. With a confused gaze, Venti Morgue asked why she had come. Dollars' eyes began to shine with seriousness, and she revealed that she had come to talk about the classmates who needed help with scholarships. She approached Venti Morgue's desk and began to show him the petitions. With a curious gaze, the professor began to read carefully, and Dollars explained that these were the petitions of students who, due to family problems, would not be able to continue next semester. The petitions included data from those who could not maintain good grades because they worked part-time and from those who avoided working in order to obtain the scholarship. She began to stare at the teacher with a serious gaze and made it clear that among the students who had received the scholarship, there were some who needed a re-evaluation. She also mentioned that there was a considerable number of students who, although they came from wealthy families, forged their documents to appear as if they were from poor households and thus obtained scholarships fraudulently. It was necessary to recover those scholarships and redistribute them among the students who really needed them. Venti Morgue began to stare at her and his eyes widened with rage. Little by little he was losing patience, pointing at Dollars with his finger. He made it clear that the scholarships were granted according to school regulations. As president of the student council, she was the one who had to respect and enforce those rules. With a furious gaze, she placed her hand on the table and asked the professor to review again the disadvantaged students that the regulations might be overlooking. Venti Morgue was furious to see that she was saying he had to do the work twice, with eyes shining with determination. Dollars made it clear that as president of the student council, she had the obligation to raise her voice for the difficulties of the students. With an angry expression, Venti Morgue questioned who was going to take responsibility for the burden involved in him having to do the work twice, knowing that she was not someone who would double his salary. Little by little, Dollars also began to lose patience. Her eyes began to shine with contempt upon seeing that Venti Morgue was upset because he had to do the work twice. Placing her hands on the table, she began to stare intently at Venti Morgue and made it clear that this was a matter affecting the future of the students. The tension in the room began to rise, and just then, our boy opened the office door. The attention of Venti Morgue and Dollars focused on Vikier, and their eyes widened with curiosity. They didn't know what he was doing there. Our boy, who was holding a bag full of gold coins, began to show a serene gaze. Seeing that he had entered the professor's office without even knocking on the door, Venti Morgue mocked him by asking if his parents hadn't taught him manners at home. Upon hearing this, Vikier began to remember his father and the manners he had taught him, and with a smile, Hugo said that the family motto was to respect the strong. Vikier began to gaze toward the ground in silence, making Dollars feel somewhat confused. Venti Morgue began to touch his face, closed his eyes and asked why Vikier had come, not knowing if he too had come to complain about not having received a scholarship. With a confused gaze, Vikier began to walk toward his table. Dollars' attention was fixed on our boy, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat curious. Vikier left the bag of coins on top of Venti Morgue's table. The professor's attention was fixed on the bag and his mind filled with curiosity. Our boy opened the bag, revealing the shiny gold coins. With a sincere gaze, he began to observe the professor and revealed that he had come to pay his tuition. Upon seeing the shiny gold coins, Venti Morgue's eyes widened in surprise. With a suspicious gaze, he asked where Vikier had gotten so much money. Our boy adjusted his glasses and mentioned that he had participated in the expedition against the gnolls. By chance, the fire he had lit while resting fell on the gnoll cave, and the swarm was completely annihilated. Venti Morgue placed his hands on top of the table and began to stand up. According to him, this made no sense. With a calm gaze, Vikier said that Venti Morgue could ask Minnie Pin, the guide who had accompanied him, and also questioned whether with this amount of money he would be able to pay for next semester's tuition. Venti Morgue began to observe the gold coins carefully and his eyes expanded with curiosity. He picked up several gold coins and left them on top of the table. mentioning that this was more than enough. Vikier could pay full tuition for all 4 years at once in a single payment. Vikier began to gaze at the ground and said that the rest of the money was also to pay for tuition. Dollar's attention was fixed on our boy and she couldn't help but sweat. With a serious gaze, Venti Morgi made it clear that the amount of leftover money was too much just to pay for tuition. He didn't know if our boy was thinking about buying a building. According to him, Vikier was aiming for a professorship, not a student position. With a calm expression, Vikier asked Venti Morg to use the rest of the money for students who had not been able to pay their tuition. Upon hearing this, Dollar's eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe it. With a confused gaze, Venti Morgi questioned whether Vikier really intended to donate all this money for scholarships. Vikier nodded his head but mentioned that under one condition. The condition for receiving this money was that students must complete a certain number of volunteer hours at an orphanage. With a serene expression, Venti Morg began to point at Vikier with his finger, and asked if he wanted to give the scholarship a name, and suggested calling it the Vikier Scholarship. Our boy wanted to remain anonymous, so he decided to call the scholarship Perry Scholarship. Upon hearing this, Dollar's eyes filled with surprise. She put her hands over her mouth and couldn't help but blush. With eyes shining with determination, Vikier asked Venti Morg to call the scholarship Perry Scholarship. It was already late and the sun was setting, and somewhere in the academy was the student council room. In this room were President Dollars and the others. Students had heard that this time an important scholarship sponsor had appeared. According to them, this was incredible since now one could obtain a scholarship by doing volunteer work in an orphanage. It was said that noble and powerful families were excluded from scholarships. Dollars clasped her hands and began to ponder in silence. No one knew who the anonymous donor was that had saved the lives of underprivileged students at the academy. With eyes full of curiosity, she couldn't help but wonder what Vikier's true identity was. She began to imagine Vikier and the others. Our boy had obtained first place in the written midterm exam, and also ranked among the top in the practical part. He was a very conscientious student, without flaws and with good relationships with his classmates. She began to remember when Vikier was in Venti Morgi's office. She knew that the eyes hidden behind the glasses seemed cold, but she couldn't know what was inside Vikier. The image of Vikier sitting with Perry came to her mind. Perry was a girl who had been sacrificed in the fight against Dantalion, and Vikier still remembered her. She stood up and began to walk. For her it was clear that Vikier had a warm heart hidden behind his cold exterior. Her eyes began to shine with love and she couldn't help but blush. She reached the door of Vikier's room and remained silent. She wanted to see Vikier and talk to him. With eyes full of nervousness, she began to bring her hand closer to the door. This feeling was one of responsibility and debt. Like someone who had seen the end of Perry together with the Nightblood Hound during the fight against Dantalion. Just then Piggy, who was scratching his neck, opened the door and upon seeing Dolores, his eyes filled with surprise and curiosity. Dolores and Piggy remained silent. With a confused gaze, she asked where Vikier was. Piggy turned toward the room and with a sincere expression realized that she had come looking for Vikier. Piggy mentioned that he didn't know where Vikier was now, since he always wandered at night. Upon hearing this, something caught Dolores' attention and her eyes began to shine with surprise. Piggy started touching his head, closed his eyes and with a nervous expression admitted that the room was empty. The lower part belonged to Vikier. But he couldn't have much luggage there. It was as if he were someone who could leave at any moment. Dolores' eyes began to shine with curiosity. Piggy turned his head and with a sincere expression admitted that Vikier seemed to have some and, as a roommate he was worried that he would leave. Once Piggy turned around his eyes widened in confusion. Dolores left the room, turned her back on him and began to walk away. Piggy started touching his head and his eyes filled with confusion, while the sunlight was illuminating the hallway. Dolores began walking away and she couldn't help but wonder if Vikier was the Nightblood Hound. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,